Very glad to be here, and thank you to the organisers for asking me. This has been a conference about children in crisis, and I'm wanting to ask the question, what do we actually mean when we say that we want to put children at the centre? What are the moral justifications for that approach? Has it in fact become harder for us to understand this concept when in practice what has been at the centre is paid work? So we're now entering the third day, the afternoon of a 3-day conference. I think everyone is probably in agreement that children are in crisis. Paper after paper, white paper after green paper, report after report, and of course interview after interview bemoans the reality of child poverty in a country like New Zealand. And of course there are the abuse issues. So this is a land of plenty. Why is it so hard for us to turn this around? It's a failure of the heart. It's a failure of imagination, a failure of compassion and kindness. New Zealand seems to have lost its way. And I had the privilege of having a few days in Berlin about 2 months ago, and I was reminded so forcibly there of how if a society condones the first act of injustice, or excuses it, or minimises it, then it paves the way for the next act and the next. And then finally we become trapped in a monstrous scenario and paralysed to know how to escape. So I want to suggest that we've been so beguiled by the dogma of the free market that we have actually allowed progressively fundamental errors in our policies for children with little thoughtful resistance. And now we are trapped, and it's very difficult to see how we can get out. I'm going to point specifically to policy watersheds of 1991, 1996, and 2005 to 2007 to illustrate that. I wanted to use this cartoon, apologies to Dr. Zeus, because I think it has a really important message. And the wolf ate the children, but it didn't matter, because they were the children of. And you can put your own word in there from what you hear. Is it the colour of people's skin? Is it soul mothers? Is it people that are not like us? The children themselves in this cartoon are appalled at the smug adult prejudices. Are we good people in New Zealand, in this room, in the children's movement, sufficiently appalled at what we see in children in crisis? I suggest that we've seen the enemy, and to some extent it is us. And to get the change that we want, we first and foremost must have a very different, child-centric, colourblind, non-judgmental change of heart. No ifs, no buts, and no exceptions. Now, fortunately for me, Professor Jonathan Boston has already addressed you, and so now you fully understand all the intricacies of poverty measurement. He raised a very fundamental point. He asked, why have the high rates that we see been tolerated? And you can see, I remind you of what he would have drawn attention to, that very large jump in child poverty in the early 90s. So why have these high rates been largely tolerated for more than 2 decades, despite the conventional view that New Zealand has been a comparatively egalitarian country and a great place to bring up children? Now, academics love this kind of stuff. But I want to suggest with this cartoon that there is a trap for academics, that we can have whole conferences that just debate which particular poverty measure to use, and we lose sight of the sole parent holding onto the screaming baby. It becomes about something else. So Jonathan Boston himself thoughtfully moved you on from the arcane world of poverty measurement and suggested that we shouldn't be just sidetracked into debating these measures. I want to first examine a little more the reasons for our current dilemma and ground these in contemporary history that we have poorly understood. When we leave this conference, it's important to reflect on how to get the changes we need to see, not in 10 years' time, not by the time of the next conference or the one after, but immediately. I want to also mention the work of Child Poverty Action Group, which is the organisation that I'm associated with, and the implications of our recent endeavours to get justice for poor children in New Zealand in the courts. So just to return to Jonathan Boston, he gave you a range of reasons why we might have this tolerance to child poverty. Very correctly, in my view, he said this: unless the incomes of workless households with children can be boosted significantly by one means or another, major reductions in child poverty will be extremely difficult to achieve. It is critical that policymakers grasp this point. That is really important. So can I just reinforce that? It is about money. We're not going to do it without money. He suggested that a rather large, daunting amount, almost, of money, injection of state spending is required. And he noted specifically the children who have been left behind in families on benefits. So I want to just start my remarks by reviewing some of the history around how we ended up with our appalling state of child poverty in New Zealand. Now, we could start the story back in the Victorian era and trace that powerful imagery of the deserving and the undeserving poor that affects us still today. But in the interest of time, let's start in the 1930s. And in September, because it was 35 years after the passage of Michael Joseph Savage's Act, 1938 Act, we had an event to celebrate what that was all about. So I thought that it was quite a good place for me to start my remarks. The 1930s had been a time of widespread distress, a time of huge shame and stigma for the deserted wife, the illegitimate child, the single unwed mother. There was a widespread reliance in the Great Depression on private charity, and that was viewed as demeaning and a much hated relic of the old country. So at the end of the 1930s, 75 years ago, Michael Joseph Savage held out a vision of an inclusive society. The 1938 Act was a bold collective decision to share the costs that fall so unevenly and unexpectedly in times of misfortune, unemployment, ill health, all when bringing up children. And so we got the modern welfare state arising out of that act. And of course, not everyone was quick to embrace these new ideas, but it's fair to say that by the post-war period, hearts and minds of New Zealanders, regardless of political party, had been profoundly changed. And really the story I'm trying to tell in this address is one of hearts and minds. The Act extended child-related benefits paid to the mother and the contributions to the social fabric on which society so utterly depends became valued and respected. And by the time we get to 1946, we've got a universal family benefit of a significant amount, a payment for all children, and despite much resistance, that included Maori, illegitimate, children in deserted families, all children were included. The policy was very inclusive and egalitarian, and the accounts of it suggest it was greatly important for the well-being of all children. So now going towards the post-war period, the benefit of the universal family benefit was apparent. It put money in the hands of the mother, not regarded as tax relief, not something to offset the husband's tax at the end of the year, but something that she got in her account. She controlled it for the needs of the children. It went with her on separation or divorce, and it was seen by mothers as an unambiguous tribute to their working role in the home. The minister of the time said, "We have to create such enthusiasm for the service mother renders that it will be lifted to the highest pinnacles of service to the nation." Policy rhetoric today: a mother is valued, I'm sad to say, only for the paid work she does, not the work of procreation, nurturing, mentoring the young that she is entrusted with. Now, I grew up in the post-war period, which was a period of great privilege. The doctor visited, believe it or not, milk in schools, very good access to health care, mother at home, fortunate in having access to a very nice lifestyle. Mother had prenatal, postnatal care, spent 2 weeks in hospital, came home with a Karatani nurse. Children that needed extra help were given help with Karatani nurses, or there were health camps. I'm sure that many of you will know a lot of that history. It was a very privileged time, and it was an egalitarian time. It probably wasn't quite the wonderful egalitarian utopia that some of us think we remember, but poverty was something that we were not conscious of on an everyday basis. We didn't see child poverty, it wasn't in our face. As a young mother in the 70s, however, I was very conscious of elder poverty. So we were exhorted at Christmas time to give money, to give Christmas cheer parcels, the Auckland Star collection, for these poor old people. And so we worried about that. But I can't remember in the 70s being conscious of or worrying about too much child poverty. In 1976, what happened was that we had the national government introduce national superannuation. So elder poverty overnight became largely a thing of the past. And I suggest that that has enormous messages for us as we grapple with the issue of how do we deal with child poverty. So there's Muldoon. Can we do it? Yes, we can. We'll just give them enough money and then problems will disappear. Well, of course they don't entirely disappear, but it was pretty good. They largely disappeared. This conference has shown that child poverty is complex and multidimensional. It's about improving incomes, housing, education, access to healthcare, and I'm not wanting to minimise the other three in concentrating on incomes. But to go back to what Jonathan Boston said, we're deluding ourselves if we think we can solve child poverty without increasing incomes. Let's now just jump to the 1980s, where we had the beginning of the market reforms and the start of the distress that we were seeing in many communities around New Zealand. However, in 1988, the Royal Commission on Social Policy, 50 years after the 1938 Social Security Act, so just 25 years ago, after their deliberations, came to this conclusion that our values and national ideals should be about full participation, fulfilling lives based on certainty and security for all, with a special emphasis on children. Now that's what they thought was really important, to prioritise children. But by the end of the 80s, this really hit a bum note for people out there. Certainty and security, participate in society, children prioritised, it all sounded very quaint. And by the time the report was delivered, it was described as a doorstop by the politicians. The ethical principles inherited from Michael Joseph Savage had been forgotten, and the new dogma of the market was cemented in. And those dogmas took hold with ferocity in the late 1980s. Unemployment soared, deregulated monetary sector led to an exploding share market, and when that went down in 1987, it took the dreams of many middle and lower income people with it. Many families were suffering the dislocation and loss of traditional work. The egalitarian post-war world was over. So I want to say, when we're thinking about children's policy and where we've gone wrong in a fundamental sense, that our first error was to accept the 1991 budget. And here are the children, as a result of the budget, not in an Oliver Twist sense going and asking for more, but actually putting the little bit that they had back in the soup pot. And I became interested in family finances in the early 1980s. I was approached by the New Zealand Committee for Children and asked to analyse the budget of 1981. After that, on a regular basis every year, I was looking at the budget, and I was sitting in an ivory tower, but I became, by the end of the 80s, extremely concerned with what I was seeing, because I could see the financial pressures that families were under at the end of the 80s. So it was with incredulous dismay that I listened to Ruth Richardson and Jenny Shipley in December 1990 announce draconian measures to cut back the welfare state by cutting benefits. And in that budget, the last vestiges of the welfare state being about preventing poverty, providing security, allowing participation and belonging, were obliterated. I quite like this cartoon because there's an irony in it. The cartoonist of the day, and this was after the budget in 1991, thought he was being funny. So the guy's saying, "This budget of yours is going to hit everyone except little children, Ruth." And Ruth's saying, "By Jove, you're right. I forgot all about them." Well, please, that budget was all about the impact on families and children. It was just not necessarily so evident to the politicians of the day. And when we look at the media around what was said in the early 1990s, it was all this increasing distress that was impacting on the children and on their families. And so this is the period of rocketing child poverty that was in the graph that Jonathan Boston showed you. In the 1991 budget, the old were also going to have their national superannuation changed into a welfare benefit. But their powerful lobby was successful in reversing that, again showing we can do it if we care enough. So when we examine today the fortunes of the old versus the fortunes of the young, about 3 or 4% only of those over 65 are in serious or significant hardship, compared to 19% of children. So this shows us, I think, 3 important things. First of all, money matters. It can make a considerable difference. Secondly, it's not about the wealth of the country, it is a choice. Thirdly, we can do it if we have politicians that act decisively as Muldoon did. And there is a powerful lobby, which there was for the old in the 90s, that protects the interest of the poor and says no firmly to politicians whose policies are harmful. Treating the symptoms, the charity model, and the way in which that became reinvigorated from the period following the budget in 1991. In 1991, Ruth Richardson boasted that she would change the hearts and minds of New Zealanders. Michael J. Savage had changed the hearts and minds of New Zealanders. She was going to change the hearts and minds in New Zealanders, but in the direction of division and discrimination. People were to blame for their situation. They should be standing on their own 2 feet. The political rhetoric became about how welfare should be only for the poor. Work is the way out of poverty. People need sticks and carrots. So self-reliance, private insurance, private saving, private charity, and private providers replaced notions of community interdependence and social security. Ruth Richardson was enormously successful in capturing hearts and minds in ways that have been both blatant and subtle. Benefits were to be cut to incentivise work because work was the way out of poverty. Instead, those cuts intensified poverty. The universal family benefit was abolished. All the weekly per-child family assistance paid to the mother became conditional on the total income of the family. At least at that point, we were not separating out some classes of children and treating them differently from other classes of children. What we have today is a World Vision Sponsorship Society. $15 a month to buy the basics. $15 a month, as suggested in this ad, would be $180 a year. What I'm going to be talking about is the denial of a payment, which is at least $3,000 for a family that misses out on a significant payment, I'll talk about in a minute. It misses out where other families get it. So this is the tragedy of what we've set up. A World Vision Society where we are sponsoring children for the basics at the same time as our policies deny them sufficient money to do this for themselves. It is a tragedy that such programs are needed and that small gifts of raincoats and food are so appreciated. And this is not to decry or put down the efforts of this sector. It's needed, it's necessary, but it's created by our attitudes and our policies. And so what we have done since the early 90s is to put paid work at the centre of our social policies. And we've had our policies spin off that centrality of paid work. And I've got a number of examples there which you may not be able to read. A whole variety of policies that affect children look a particular way because those policies serve the needs of the corporate sector. A very obvious example is early childhood education and the hours that these centres have to be open to, not reflecting necessarily the needs of the children, but the needs of the workplace. So this was the way that hearts and minds were changed. Paid work was put at the centre. Children themselves and the unpaid work of caring for them was rendered invisible, as this diagram illustrates. They're just not there. Bad policies that have produced the concerns of this week's conference were spun off that centrality and was set in train with the focus on paid work, a vicious circle. So mothers are forced out to work. That means they've got less time to prepare meals or entertain their children, creates more work in the fast food area, in the after-school holiday programs. The subsidies support the profits in the early childhood education sector, creating more work. Welfare reforms spawn an industry of private providers to hassle women back into work, creating more work. So much new paid work is not only of dubious value, but it is actually underpinned by state money, which is then not available to reward the unpaid work that women would otherwise do. So our first era was the 1991 budget and the centrality of paid work. The second era was in 1996, and it reflected this idea that you have to design policies to put paid work at the centre. And so what had happened to that family assistance payment that went to the caregiver on a weekly basis for her children from the early period, the mid-1980s, and this example is just for a one-child family, but we can do it for other families. We're looking here at the value of the amount that she got in the hand. And you can see the line coming down very dramatically. And that was because family assistance had been neglected. High inflation, it was not adjusted, and it just lost value. So by the time we get to the mid-1990s, even the government of the day, captured as it was by neoliberalism, was realising that children needed a catch-up. Everything else was indexed. Where was the inflation catch-up for children? And so it was decided that each child needed an extra $20 a week in order to make up for inflation. But this was where the ideology came in, that of that $20, $15 was marked off and not given to the undeserving. The deserving children, who were children defined to be in families independent from the state, got the full $20. The others got $5, and they are the bottom line that you can see there, a little bit of a jump up, the $5, and then further erosion as, again, towards the end of the 90s, family assistance was neglected. And you got this gap between the deserving and the undeserving. Now, with respect to the child tax credit, which was the name of that $15, Child Poverty Action Group first complained to the Human Rights Commission. This is 17 years ago. At the time, government was not subject to the human rights legislation, and the case did not progress. Labor and opposition, however, vowed to remove this discrimination by treating all children the same, giving all children that extra $20. However, what happened? And this brings me back to a point I made earlier, that one injustice paves the way for the next and the next. When Labor got in 1999, much to our surprise, and despite the promise to eliminate child poverty, first of all, they did nothing. They did bring back income-related rents, and child poverty, despite buoyant economic conditions, remained very high. The Social Security Act, reflecting the emphasis that Labor as well as National were putting on the centrality of paid work, adopting the third way view that work is the way out of poverty. Work is about how you become socially included. What happened was they changed the Social Security Act and wrote this into it: paid work and paid employment offers the best opportunity for people to achieve social and economic well-being. Paid work is the only way out of poverty. When work does not pay, because free markets drive down wages and then work must be subsidised to make work pay. Any kind of work is good so long as it is paid, and caregiving children is definitely not work unless it is done by strangers for money. So what did Labor actually do about child poverty? They ignored the child tax credit year after year after year. Finally, in the middle of the 2000s, we get Working for Families, which took the existing family assistance payment, which through the period had been neglected. So it should have been going up with inflation, it's slightly going down in that curve. And they boosted it with working for families. Astonishingly, Labor took the $15 child tax credit and changed it into the in-work tax credit of $60 a week for 1 to 3 child families, with progressively more for larger families. More generous, more exclusionary. The rot had set in. And this is what we have today. And why are we not more concerned? Payments for children are doubly targeted, first by income and second by work status. Just as in the Depression, there are now 2 classes of children again. 230,000 children in benefit households do not get the full working for families other low-income children get. 170,000 children are in families below the very low 50% poverty line. And it's worse that even if a family is not on a benefit, if the hours of work are not met because there's an earthquake or redundancy or a recession or a separation, the in-work tax credit has to be repaid. You can't have it if you do not meet the hours of work. We should not be surprised that child poverty is such a problem when caregivers in families are denied a very significant payment for the children of at least $60 per week per family. So that was the third error, the in-work tax credit, that compounded the problems of the child tax credit and conflated all those ideas about the centrality of paid work. The Ministry of Social Development itself, in 2012, said working for families had little, if any, impact on the poverty rates for children in workless households. So working for families was supposed to address child poverty. It didn't have any impact on the poorest children. Is there not something significantly remiss about this? Under the Official Information Act, we have found that increasingly significant numbers of people on benefits with dependent children, including some with children under the age of 5, are having their benefits cut by up to 50% for not meeting their obligations. We're releasing a report on benefit sanctions next week. Where are the children in this policy? So one injustice is now begetting yet another one. Who oversees these sanctions? Who asks who feeds the children? Who is accountable? What is the appeal process, if any? What are the mental and health consequences of the system? And where is the proof that this does any good at all? But we have now classified a group of families as the other, so we can do these things. When a mother faces the impossible hurdles of transport costs, childcare access, illness, it may be perfectly rational for her to decline that temporary job at the minimum pay on the other side of town. It could be an unsafe job, cold calling, or worse. Use your imagination. In the twilight labyrinth of welfare speak rules, she must be reformed and sanctioned and corralled into work and demonised for any indiscretion. How can that be good for her children? Challenging the centrality of paid work. We now have to, if we're going to get ourselves out of this dilemma that we are in, consciously put that child back at the centre of policy and ask what would our policies look like if the child really was at the centre. Well, one thing that would be clear, if we're talking about working for families, is that all caregivers would get the full working for families, as they do in Australia. They are already looking after their children, looking after their children. If they choose, they can use part of working for families to pay for someone else to do the work of child rearing, but they themselves are already working. And that would be how we would look at it if we were thinking about the needs of the child at the centre. I mentioned Australia, and we could spend quite a bit of time talking about what they do in Australia, but I thought it might be instructive just to put a table up to show you that here is our nearest neighbour that does nothing like what we do by way of these discriminatory policies for children. So here's a sole parent with one child as a comparison. And in Australia, if we're looking at the sole parent payment, the DPB or whatever it's called, in Australia it's much more generous. That's Australian dollars, of course, are worth more than New Zealand dollars anyway. So the first thing is that their payment is more generous. The second thing is that for that child, for somebody on the domestic purposes benefit, that first child gives them $92. They get twice as much as that in Australia because they don't have this discrimination. In New Zealand, there'd be another $60 in the deserving families' pockets for that first child. But for the one on the benefit, 92 compared to 178 in Australia, or if it's a first child, 217 on an annual basis for the first year. They did get rid of their baby bonus, but they still have, for the first child, a baby bonus of $2,000 a year and $1,000 for subsequent children. We don't do anything as inclusive as that. And we never learn, we never look at Australia. Now, as I said, I could go on at length about what Australia does, and we don't. And of course, we don't have time. But I just want to draw attention to one thing. They have a very well-indexed system for their child tax credits that are paid to the caregiver. And I just wanted you to look at this fourth bullet point down, threshold of abatement, family tax credit, 48,000. So a family can have over 48,000 before they start to lose any of their much more generous tax credits. What we're doing in New Zealand is we've frozen the rate and we're bringing it down. And so by 2018, it's going to be 35,000 in New Zealand. We are not protecting that group that are around about the 30,000, 40,000 bracket at all. And we're very, very different. I was interested to see the school kids bonus, $400 for a child at secondary school, given to every child, just like that. A whole lot of things that are much better in Australia. And you can say, all right, they're a wealthier country, but they have a different priority, and that's the truth of it. Okay, time is short, and I'll have to get a move on. I wanted to ask, what are we afraid of that means that we can't act on this? Is it that we think that sole parents will just be lazy, that they won't work when they should be working? They'll have more children, that marriages will break up. We need to get over that, surely, and trust mothers to know what is best, especially when they have young children. They'll work if paid work is feasible and works with their children. Let's make that a little bit easier for them by doing things like rewarding an extra hour of work. Take a quick look at what happens when we've got a sole parent on the domestic purposes benefit and she's supposed to be working 15 hours. If it's at $15 an hour, it's going to take her over $200 a week. So what happens to that dollar she earns over $200 a week? She pays tax, she pays ACC, she loses her benefit at the rate of 70 cents in the dollar. She'll have very often a student loan. She'll be captured by the repayment, 12.5 cents in the dollar. That means that actually she's worse off by having that dollar. She loses more than $1. Well, what a ridiculous Don't talk about work incentives. Don't talk about the in-work tax credit being a work incentive. Look at what we do, what we actually do in practice to disincentivise work effort and not to reward the efforts that people make. What are we going to do then about recovering hearts and minds? I want to suggest that a human rights approach is quite a fruitful way to go, and there's been a lot of talk about the human rights obligations that we have signed up to in this conference. So I don't need to repeat all this again about the best interests of the child and the right of children to social security. It's all there. So isn't it a good enough starting point? Every policy should be subject to scrutiny as to whether it infringes these precious rights of childhood. If we had this as our policy framework, we would make policy as if children actually mattered. And we would, of course, be prioritising children as a matter of course. Well, what have we done in Child Poverty Action Group to try to do that? As I said, we complained in 1996 about the child tax credit. There have been in and outs of the court system over the years, and I won't have time to take you through all of this, but finally we ended up in the Human Rights Tribunal, by which time the child tax credit had morphed into the much bigger, more generous, more exclusionary in-work tax credit. So it was a fight against the in-work tax credit. So what happened in the court, I think I have a Human Rights Tribunal picture. It was a fascinating 2-4 weeks of submissions, transcripts, judgments, and tens of thousands of pages were written. What happened there was that there was the decision made by that court that the in-work tax credit is a payment for children, it is discriminatory, and it causes serious harm. So the exact wording was this: we're satisfied that the Working for Families package as a whole, eligibility rules for the in-work tax credit in particular, treats families in receipt of an income-tested benefit less favourably than it does families in work, and thus the families that miss out were and are disadvantaged in a real and substantive way. But then they also said, essentially, government can do this in a free and democratic society. Would it not be allowed to do it in a command society, perhaps? We thought this actually wasn't good enough for the children that we represented. We appealed to the High Court, and we were heard in 2011. Judgment there was very unsatisfactory, with children all but invisible in the final judgment. The court used some highly technical arguments to say there may have been some limited discrimination for about 1,200 sole parents. In the meantime, we had the Greens bill. Do you remember this? In which the Greens were arguing that the in-work tax credit should be given to all families on the same basis, exactly what our court case was about. That was defeated in the House by 61 votes to 60. Guess whose vote? Family Values Man. We then appealed to the Court of Appeal, and the decision on the Court of Appeal came out a month ago. They also found the in-work tax credit part of Working for Families was discriminatory and caused material harm to the beneficiary families who were excluded. That means they agree that there was significant harm to 230,000 children who are already New Zealand's most disadvantaged. This, of course, disproportionately affects Māori and Pacifica children, and thus is indirectly discriminatory. Now, the court had to weigh up the harm against the intention of the policy. They decided effectively that the possibility that some tiny numbers of sole mothers who might have initially been incentivised to do at least 20 hours of paid work justified the harm. They did not understand that making a work incentive out of a payment to address child poverty was deeply contradictory. So it perfectly illustrates that paid work, not children, is at the centre as far as the courts are concerned at the moment. It might change in the future. We don't see that there is much point in taking it to the Supreme Court because we don't think children can wait for us to do that. We would rather now fight this issue as an election issue. And I'd like to leave this as a challenge to this conference because it is true, every indicator, here's what's happening in the Auckland City Mission with the demand for food parcels, every indicator is showing us that our poorest children are in crisis. So the challenge that I have is for us to understand that the cost to the non-deserving families every year since 1996 has been cumulative. And this cumulative impact of loss of wealth, which is about 5 billion so far and rising every year that we continue, is a very important contributor to the problems that we have. Can I give the last word to the Ministry of Social Development in this year's report? What did they say? They said the fall in child poverty rates between 2004 and 2007 for children in one full-time, one workless, two-parent households was very large, 28% to 9%, reflecting the Working for Families impact, especially through the in-work tax credit. The in-work tax credit addressed their poverty. For those that missed out on the in-work tax credit, they say from 2007 to 2012, poverty rates were around 6 to 7 times higher for children in workless households. This is to a large degree reflecting the greater Working for Families assistance for working families than for beneficiary families. Does the children's movement condone this discrimination? I would like to say, of course not, but the voices, with some notable exceptions, are muted. Hearts and minds are not fully unshackled from the unrelenting focus on work approach to child poverty. From the Office of the Children's Commissioner down, politicians need to hear that they must deal with child poverty first and not use a child poverty reduction payment as a tool to incentivise sole parents into work. It does not work and it makes things worse. And once we establish an agreed principle, can we have an agreed principle that all low income children should be treated the same and the needs of children are put first, then all the other policies, such as benefit levels, welfare reform, paid parental leave, early childhood education, can be addressed with this new lens. Thank you.